morning. This lecture video is going to focus on digestion and the structures, function, and histology involved with the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. And the next lecture videos will kind of look at the stomach, small intestines, and large intestines. But this is our starting point. So starting at the mouth, right? So the mouth is going to involve, or your oral cavity, your cheeks, your tongue, and your palates. Like I said, it's also called the oral cavity, sometimes called the buccal cavity. If you've ever had a buccal swab done, it's a scraping of the inside of your cheek to get some cells, so that's where that comes from. At the entrance of the oral cavity are your lips. You have an upper and a lower lips. They're also called the labia, or the labium is singular. So their outer covering is a skin, which is going to transition to a mucous membrane into the mouth proper. Lips actually are very vascular. You probably already know this when you've had a paper cut and it's bled, so there's a lot of blood supply. There is a very thin layer of keratin, which is going to give it its red kind of color. The lips cover the orbicularis oris muscle, which is going to regulate what comes in and what goes out of the mouth. So they do play a role in, especially when you get to swallowing, kind of making sure that things aren't coming out. If you touch your tongue up to the inside of your lips, in between your lips and your teeth, this is the labial frenulum, which is a midline fold of membrane that's going to attach the inner surface of each lip to the gum. So you can kind of feel that with your tongue. The cheeks make up the oral cavity's sidewall, right here. If you also run your tongue along the roof of your mouth, you'll notice that there is a hard section called the hard palate. And then in the very posterior part, the tissue becomes a little fleshier, and this is called the soft palate. And soft palate is going to be composed mainly of skeletal muscles. You can therefore manipulate it and whenever you need to yawn, swallow, or even when you want to sing. So the tongue is the strongest muscle in your body. Those who stake this claim cite its strength proportionate to its size. So obviously there are muscles in your legs that are stronger, but looking at it in terms of the size, it is a workhorse. So it is going to facilitate ingestion, mechanical digestion, chemical digestion. Also plays a role in sensation with your taste buds, taste, texture, and temperature of food, swallowing, and vocalization. So that baby has a lot of jobs. It's attached to the mandible, the styloid process of the temporal bones, and then the hyoid bone. Underneath your tongue, you can feel that connective piece of tissue that tethers the tongue to the floor of the bone, and that's called the lingual frenulum. It's not actually, well, it would be down right into here, would be the lingual. The gingiva then is going to refer to your gums. So you have the upper gingiva and then you have the lower gingiva. Also located within your oral cavity is going to be salivary glands. So these are going to be housed within the mucosous membrane of your mouth and your tongue. Their job is to help moisten food. Saliva that is actually produced contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, and its job is to start the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates, specifically starch. So when you eat, let's say, a big bowl of spaghetti, as you're chewing it and mixing around in your mouth, this salivary amylase that's in your saliva is going to actually help start breaking down the carbohydrates. It won't do it all. The food doesn't spend enough time in your mouth for all of the carbohydrates to get broken down, but it will get a start. There are three main salivary glands. The submandibular gland, which is located right in here, and it's going to secrete saliva into the mouth through the submandibular duct, so right here underneath your tongue. The sublingual glands, which is going to be up in here, is also going to secrete saliva through the lesser sublingual duct into the oral cavity. So the sublingual is actually below your tongue. Your submandibular is going to be below the sublingual gland. And then the parotid gland is going to lie between the skin and the masseter muscle near the ears, so up back here. And it's going to secrete saliva into the mouth through the parotid duct, which is located near the upper molar tooth. So you can see where this parotid duct is going to come in. So these are the salivary glands and where saliva is going to enter into your mouth. Your saliva glands are going to be activated by your parasympathetic nervous system. So if there's no food involved, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to keep saliva flowing at just the right level for you to be able to speak, to be able to swallow, to sleep, to go about your general life activities without too much saliva or too little saliva. If you are stimulated by the smell of food, so that plate of spaghetti is sitting right in front of you and you're hungry, that is going to stimulate saliva production to occur, getting ready for food to enter in and to be broken down. However, during times of stress, if you've ever had like dry mouth, you're about to give a speech and your mouth gets really dry, right? You're stressed out. That's going to be because that stress is activated by the sympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system will decrease the activity of your salivary glands, giving you dry mouth. So that's why you get cotton mouth when you're stressed out. It's because the sympathetic nervous system, that stress system, is going to basically shut down those salivary glands versus your parasympathetic, which is kind of the rest and digest system. That's going to help produce saliva as you need it. Moving on to your teeth. So during the course of your lifetime, you have two sets of teeth, your baby teeth, your adult teeth, right? You have 32 permanent teeth. There are 8 incisors. These are the teeth that are on the top, 4 top and 4 bottom, and are the sharp front teeth that you use for biting into food. Right? So here's your central incisors, and here's your lateral incisors. Then you have 4 cuspids or canines. These are going to flank either sides of the incisors. They have a pointed edge, or the cusp. That's where you get the word cuspid from. And their job is to tear up food. These are kind of the fang-like teeth, so they work really well in piercing food. Right posterior to the cuspids are your 8 premolars, also called your bicuspid teeth, which have an overall flatter shape with 2 rounded cusps that are used to mash. And then the most posterior or back teeth are your molars. They have several pointed cusps, and their job is to crush food so it's ready for swallowing. You might have heard of wisdom teeth. So they are a type or an example of molar that are embedded up into the gum. Sometimes they start to come out, but sometimes their eruption is delayed until early adulthood. It's not uncommon for wisdom teeth to fail to come down and come out, in which case then they end up getting surgically removed. So if you've had your wisdom teeth removed, that is why that has happened. Looking real quickly at the anatomy of the tooth, you have a crown, which is the portion projecting above the gum line, and then you have the root, which is kind of embedded into the maxilla and the mandible. And there is kind of this, indentation here, which is called the neck. Both parts contain the inner pulp cavity, which contains loose connective tissue, and this is where your nerves and your blood supplies are going to run through. So here's your pulp cavity right here, and you can see the blood supply and the nerves that are in there. The region of the pulp cavity that runs through the root of the tooth is called the root canal. Surrounding this pulp cavity then is the dentin. So you can see that right here. This is a bone-like tissue. And in the root of each tooth, the dentin is covered by an even harder-like tissue called the cementum, which is going to be down here, really thin line. And in the crown of each tooth, the dentin is covered by an outer layer of enamel. And fun fact, enamel is the hardest substance in your body. So those are the general parts of the tooth. Moving on to the pharynx. Your pharynx is divided into 3 regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The pharynx is involved in both digestion and respiration, so it's going to be a passageway for food and air. It's going to receive food and air from the mouth. It will also receive air from the nasal cavity. So as you breathe in, and that's why sometimes if you've ever had milk come out your nose, it's because all of this is connected here. So air comes in your nose, it goes down the nasal pharynx, The oropharynx is located directly behind. So if you open up and say ah, that's the part you're going to see. And then the laryngopharynx is going to be down below. Next is the esophagus, this long tube that's going to connect the laryngopharynx down to the stomach. There are two sphincters located in the esophagus, the upper esophageal sphincter, which is going to empty food from your pharynx down into the esophagus. And then the lower esophageal sphincter is going to open up and allow food from the esophagus into the stomach. The esophagus is a muscular tube. It is approximately 10 inches in length, so just short of a foot. It's located right behind the trachea, and it is going to actually it's a flexible tube, so it will be collapsed unless swallowing is occurring and food is moving down, and then it will be stretched or distended. Looking at some histology of the esophagus, so this is in your histology packets, pictures that we'll go over. What's really important to know is that the esophagus, the mucosal layer, so the layer that's going to be touching the lumen, is going to be made of stratified squamous epithelial. So stratified, this is important because you have food moving down there and all of that friction. It's a high friction area, so we want the extra layers of epithelial tissue. That's why it's stratified, and then the cells are squamous so that it helps protect that mucosal layer. There are two types of cells that are found in this layer, basal cells and parabasal cells. The muscularis layer of the esophagus is also going to be a little bit different. So remember, there's the 4 tissue layers in all of the digestive tract. You've got the mucosal layer, and then you have the submucosal layer, and then you have the muscularis externa. Well, the muscularis layer in esophagus is going to be made up of different combinations of the 2 types of muscle. So in the upper esophagus, closer to your throat, it's going to be mostly skeletal muscle. As you move towards the middle section of the esophagus, you're going to get skeletal and smooth muscle, and then towards the bottom, it's going to be smooth muscle. And again, this is going to be because, when you're swallowing, that's more of a voluntary activity, so you would want more of that skeletal muscle. But then as it starts to move down towards the rest of the digestive tract, which is going to be under involuntary control, then you're going to need that smooth muscle. And then that middle section is kind of going to be a transition between the two. Finally, there's no peritoneum around the esophagus, so instead there's the adventitia tissue that's going to exist, and it is the serosa, more or less. It's the same thing. It's just different because it's not covered by the peritoneum. So again, here are tissue samples that you'll be needing to identify. This is esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, and you can see here the esophagus. You can really see on this picture the stratified, right? Here's a layer, so you can see the stratified, the layers that form in there. And then this top layer is the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So swallowing. We look at the process of swallowing. This is the movement of food from the mouth to the stomach. Its entire process takes approximately about 5 to 10 seconds for solid or semi-solid food, and about 1 second for soft foods and liquids. It sounds, super easy, right? We just swallow, but it's actually a little bit more complex than that. There are 3 phases to swallowing. There's the voluntary phase, the pharyngeal phase, and the esophageal phase. So during the voluntary phase, this is under voluntary control, hence its name. The tongue is going to move up and back against the palate. It's going to push the bolus to the back of the oropharynx. And then at the same time, the muscles around your lips and mouth are going to shut in order to prevent you from leaking out food or liquid. We don't want to have a drooler, right? After that is the pharyngeal phase. This is going to happen when stimulation of receptors that are in that oropharynx are going to send impulses to the deglution center, which is located in the medulla oblongata. And then the medulla is going to send impulses back to the uvula and the soft palate, causing them to move upward, which is going to close off the nasopharynx and actually close off the trachea so that we don't have food coming out of our nose And we don't have food going down our windpipe, which is the trachea, right? So this is a really important phase in making sure food goes down the esophagus where we want it to go and not back up or not down our windpipe. The esophageal phase then is going to be when the upper sphincter of the esophagus opens, allowing the bolus to move on down. The medulla oblongata will stimulate peristalsis, or those alternating muscle contractions, which will push the food down to the stomach. As it gets down there, then the esophageal lower sphincter will open, dumping the bolus into the stomach. And along this way, there are glands along the esophagus that are going to secrete mucus to help lubricate that food as it goes down and to kind of prevent friction. So this is kind of the first stages of digestion that is occurring. There is not any chemical digestion that really takes place in the esophagus. So far, we've only broken down carbohydrates in the mouth using that salivary amylase. However, there is a little bit of protein digestion that also occurs in the mouth, but mostly just that carbohydrate stuff. Now, the next lecture video will go over the stomach, small intestines, and large intestines, where a lot more chemical activity is going to take place.